It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the panel, Cuba as a Tourism Destination for Americans. I have distinguished panelists here with me today. My name is Dr. Cihan Cobanoglu. Before we go into any details, let me just go through very quick housekeeping items. You already have figured this out. You already have seen in your control panel, there's something called raise hand. This will indicate to us that you can hear us. If you please take a second and click on raise your hand, that will show us that you hear us good and clear. Please go ahead and click, yeah, which I see. Wonderful. That's great. I appreciate it for all of you who are hearing us. Again, I apologize one more time that we were broadcasting before the actual time. Okay, and the other thing is that there is a questions and answers you can see on your panel again on the top. Throughout this panel, online panel, anytime you have any question, please feel free to write here questions. And throughout this session, I am going to moderate them and I will give them to our panelists. And without further ado, I would like to thank Association for North America Higher Education International for organizing and sponsoring this webinar. This webinar today, Cuba is a Tourism Destination for Americans, has been organized as part of the International Education Week, which is celebrated in the United States of America. That's a joint initiative between the U.S. Department of Education and U.S. Department of State. Just give you some conferences that ANAHEI, Association of North America Higher Education International, organizes. The first one is IBA Conference, International Interdisciplinary Business Economics Advancement Conference, is going to take place next April on a cruise, and unfortunately this cruise is not going to Cuba yet. Maybe we'll find one of these that's going to stop in Cuba. I know that cruise companies are working on Cuba as a destination as we speak, but I didn't hear anything yet. So this is going to be in there, and if you want to have more information, ibaconference.org is the website. The other conference that ANAHEI is organizing is called Global Conference on Education and Research. This is going to take place in 22nd, 25th May 2017 at my campus, which is University of South Florida, Sarasota-Manatee. And last but not least, we have the first graduate student conference in business and economics. For the first time, we are going to integrate this conference in 25th, 26th May 2017, again at the University of South Florida, Sarasota-Manatee. ANAHEI has two different journals. We invite all of you to submit. I serve as the co-editor for both journals. One of them is International Interdisciplinary Business Economics Advancement Journal, and the other one is Journal of Global Education and Research. Both of them are open access journal, which means it's free to publish, submit, or access articles in these journals. Okay. I would like to introduce our panelists to you in alphabetical order. We normally were planning to have 3 panelists today, but Mr. Collin is in Cuba, and he was supposed to fly this morning from Cuba to DC, where he has Cuba Education Travel Agency, but unfortunately his flight got canceled, so he's still trying to get outside of Cuba to United States. So he sends his apologies, but we have Dr. Rachel Dodds with us. She's a professor at the Ted Rogers School of Hospitality and Tourism Management at Ryerson University, as well as the Director of Hospitality and Tourism Research Institute. She has a vast experience in Cuba, about Cuba, and I'm so happy that she agreed to join us. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you.
And thank you. And our next panelist is Dr. Babu George, Associate Professor of Management, Fort Hays State University. He also has a vast interest in Cuba as far as research involved, and he also visited Cuba, even though not recently, but he did. So without further ado, I would like to, oops, sorry, we normally need to put that in here. We'll go back to the again, but I would like to ask Dr. George to set the stage about today's panel. He's going to share with us some slides, and then after that we will ask Dr. Dodds to show us some pictures that she herself took in Cuba, and then we will go with the questions and discussion as we speak. Dr. George?
Yes. Okay.
Okay, here you go. I'm going to bring the slides up.
Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night from wherever you are. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you for a few minutes. Cuban tourism 2016 and beyond. I have not come up with a very comprehensive presentation. I just wanted to set the stage, highlighting 6 or 7 key points, then we would like to discuss as a team. One thing I want to say in the very beginning is there is not so much of change as the mass media or various other quarters project. The changes are more in perception rather than in facts. Take this example, Barack Obama has changed his viewpoints about US-Cuban relationship. However, any substantial changes should wait until the United States Congress approves it. So far, it is a real fact that the Americans, the number of Americans visiting Cuba has increased. It is on an ever increase. We don't know about the next year with the change in the administration, but it has been on an increasing trajectory. But that is more the result of a change in perception. It is also a fact that Obama has not prosecuted anyone who visited Cuba. During the time of George Bush, there were multiple, so many prosecutions of, people visiting Cuba. Could you please, Cihan?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, so my fascination with Cuban tourism started actually in the 2000s, early 2000s, in the Caribbean region in general. Me along with a couple of my colleagues, I have to name them, Dr. Mark Miller from the University of Southern Mississippi and Dr. Tony Hendon from University of Nevada, Las Vegas. We set out on a major research project, and the objective was to assess the strategic positioning of Cuban tourism in the 21st century. And that was my major entry into understanding tourism in Cuba. After that, various other publications came out, mostly corollaries to the original research. Then I also had the opportunity to guide a few students who focused their dissertations on PhD, DBA dissertations on Cuban tourism. Right now, I am looking into certain issues in the supply side of Cuban tourism in terms of the constraints, the massive increase in the number of American tourists to Cuba and how that is affecting the already strained supply of workers, of infrastructure, of technology, and various other things. So Cuban tourism is an enigma still. Let's see what kind of an enigma it is. So for Americans, there are 12 purposes that are legal. It's interesting because most people who travel can fit their purpose of travel to one of these 12 purposes. It is very unlikely that someone will have a reason to visit Cuba for a reason other than the ones listed in the 12. In my interactions with people who are in the field, they say that even though your actual idiosyncratic reason may be something else, it is very likely, it is very easy to fit your purpose into one of these 12. And most people do that. In any way, the US administration has been relatively lenient in prosecuting or punishing people visiting Cuba. So some of the things might raise eyebrows, especially if your objective is to work in a non-profit sector and try to do things that the government doesn't want to do, the Cuban government doesn't want to do. So from the Cuban side, you might get some resistance, but from the American side, as far as I understand, this is my hearsay, there is not a great deal of problem right now. So talking about the Cuban tourism industry, as we all might know, in the early 1950s, international tourism from the United States was thriving. That was much before, the embargo came, the early 1950s. Americans visited Cuba for gambling, sex tourism, and all kinds of quote-unquote evil. So, however, by the end of 1950s, things started changing. So, early 1960s saw entire shutdown of the U.S. tourist arrivals. After that, tourism in Cuba was mostly restricted to domestic tourism or tourism within the archipelago in the Caribbean region. 1980s, actually much before United States became more friendly in terms of travel to Cuba, international tourism restarted, especially from Europe and of course from Canada. 1994, the Ministry of Tourism, MINTOUR, was formed. The objective was to provide political direction for tourism development, just like in typical planned economies, communist societies. So, and also to monitor tourism development plans. There are a few other sub-agencies under the Ministry of Tourism. In particular, I would like to name these two agencies. They kind of control the propaganda of tourism, PR agency, Public Tour, and FinTour, the banking agency for tourism. Yes, please. Next slide, please.
Yep.
Yeah, if you see this slide, we can see that there has been a constant increase. It's not very big on the screen, but you can see Cuba is showing steady progress from 1995 to 2014. Now, generally the Caribbean region, the small island nations in the Caribbean as a whole is showing a similar trend. But one thing I want you to look at is the red graph, Puerto Rico. The American territory, it is struggling. One of the estimates, what I believe is more than other Caribbean countries, more than other Caribbean island nations, it is Puerto Rico that is probably going to face the heat of more tourism to Cuba. That is already the Puerto Rican economy is not doing really great, and I am unsure how this will have a impact. Okay, so Cuban tourism. If you look at the graph, it shows only until 2014. I have tried to collect more recent data, not fully authenticated, so I don't vouch for the information given in the slide.
Yeah, I'm trying to make the slides bigger. I think people cannot see them, but okay, give me 1 second, please. I'm going to fix this. Is this better now?
Yeah, that's full screen. Yes.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
So, the latest statistics that I have given on the left-hand side of the screen, I am not able to authenticate it independently. The other one comes from World Bank and World Tourism Organization, World Travel and Tourism Council. But the one given on the left-hand side is coming from state agencies, but not fully believable. Anyway, by 2016, Cuba estimates a tourist arrival of 4.25 million tourists, massive increase. A lot of American tourists visit Cuba for this crazy reason. Before it all goes, the last minute visits, last chance tourism. That was one reason why a lot of Americans are flocking to Cuba, based on my qualitative inquiry. I wouldn't again say that I have got a certain quantitative numbers or figures to substantiate that. But a lot of American tourism can be explained in terms of this before it all changes, before Cuba ceases to be the communist Cuba. As of now, a big problem is the availability of infrastructure, especially when I was talking about this 60,000 hotel rooms to cater to this massively increasing demand for tourism. The other problem is American tourists have begun to price cut European visitors. American tourists, they book in advance, they are willing to pay much more than the average European tourists just because of this reason, before it all goes away. They want to see how Cuba used to be. In response to this, the government, the Mintour is promoting homestays. So homestays and small-scale community-oriented projects are becoming popular, but I really do not know how that will have a, how that will impact in the future. The other thing is a lot of foreign-funded hotels are coming up, but again, there is no true market economy in Cuba. Governmental controls and regulations everywhere still rampant. The other issue is the increase in free independent travelers. It was much easier for Cuban government agencies to handle package tours. When a group of people come together, it was so much easier to handle them. But the increase in the free backpackers, independent travelers, the neo-hippies, it creates added problems.
Perfect.
This may not be really relevant for today's presentation, but I just thought, this is something that we did research on earlier. So tourism education is still in the hands of government. You need to undergo rigorous 2-year training in order to be able to work in any of the state-run or state-sponsored properties. I also came to know that very recently this state agency has been keen to develop partnership with foreign schools. A Canadian partnership is mentioned here on the slide, so Rachel must be aware of that. Yes, Cihan has asked me to reflect upon the food culture. Again, I don't have very recent first-person experiences, but it's a paradox because, Cuban cuisine is not something that is as exotic as the Americans that visit Cuba wish it to be. And when Americans visit Cuba and they see more familiar versions of cuisine that they expected it to be, that leads to disconfirmation of expectations. So one problem for restaurants in Cuba is differentiate, understand the essence of the Cubanness, the authentic Cubanness, and try to project it. But which is really hard, it's not really easy because Cuban cuisine is a fusion. Anyway, the government agencies have recently taken initiatives in creating an inventory of national and local cuisines. Yeah, some practical tips I would share with the students who might be listening to this presentation. Again, mostly from hearsay, and many of my students work in the travel trade, and I get all these tips. So one thing, if possible, try not to fly from US. Things have changed, but I hear news about people are being asked to sign an affidavit before they fly. The airliners may not share that with the government, but they don't deny the possibility of sharing it in the future. So if the administration's policies change and your travel history to Cuba becomes a government record, I don't know how that is going to impact you. So often flying from a third country is much easier. The other issue is, I don't know whether it is a current issue, US dollar is taxed. If you pay anything with US dollar, the government or the agencies charge what they call an administrative fee, which is around 10% to 13%. So carry a European currency or even Canadian dollar. So I mentioned about the 12 categories. So then it's a good idea to visit and take the service of a Cuba-based provider. Oftentimes, Americans take travel insurance from the United States. US-based travel insurances are rarely accepted, generally not accepted in Cuba. And when you land in the immigration counter, they may raise eyebrows. So better visit a agency like Assistor, which also has a service of providing you with foreign currency. For example, if you lose all the money in Cuba and if you don't have any money, you can go to them. And from what I know, they will allow one of your friends or relatives to deposit an amount of money from the US to their bank account, and they will give equivalent Cuban currency to you. Then another recent change I came to know is you can import as much rum and cigars as you want. There has been a restriction that all the imports should be within $400 US. But again, it's a gray area now because many travel agents believe that cigars and rum are excluded from this $400 US limit. So it's a good idea to explore, but if you want to import these things, I wouldn't recommend that for students. But if you want to do that, yes.
Thank you, Babu. I appreciate it. So I'm gonna go to Rachel. Rachel, I would like to start asking you. Please, a little bit, tell us about your background and how it relates to our panel topic, which is Cuba. I know that you visit Cuba frequently. Please tell us a little bit about your experience.
Sure, and I just wanted to jump in on something about the currency. US dollars are taken in Cuba, but people will not accept them because the black market economy for such a long time was problematic because everybody wanted US dollars. And because of the embargo, US dollars were more widely accepted. So there's the Cuban peso, which is what the locals use. And then there's, after a few years ago, the Cuban government decided to stop the increase of US dollars. So they still want them, but they won't take them, partially because of the embargo. And so you have to exchange them, and you exchange them for Cuban convertible pesos, better known as kooks. So these days you can give them as tips, but you can't use them in restaurants. You can't use them in hotels. You can't use them anywhere else for transportation. So you have to use the Cuban convertible peso. And that's one way that the government is regulating the black market economy. Great. So just as a thing, it's in the 90s and the early 2000s, you could use US dollars, but not now. So let me explain a little bit about myself. I don't know if there's students or academics or where everybody's from. So I'm Canadian, I'm not American, but I'm pleased to be invited here today. I just came back from Cuba about 3 weeks ago, and I was there last year as well, and I was there in the 2009, and I was also there before Cuba really opened up to tourists in sort of the very, very early 90s when it was called the difficult period. And that was a really interesting time because that was when you weren't allowed to go off the beaten track. You weren't allowed to leave the resorts. And I did. I was traveling with my family, and that's when the stereotypical scenario of where they say you meet a taxi driver and they were used to be a medical professional. That's still very, very true. But now you don't get your left hand cut off for providing meals to tourists in which is what used to happen in the early 90s. The implications of dealing with tourists was very, very severe, and now it's really opened up. So it's quite a fascinating time to visit Cuba. For everyone who doesn't know, I just thought I should put a map on the screen of where Cuba is. And you can see on the top left-hand corner is Havana, which is the capital. And the main tourism around Cuba is focused in Veradero. That's the biggest attractive point, and all the key resorts where mostly Canadians is their biggest market share. 1.5 Canadians out of their current 3 million come from Canada. And we sit on the beach and do nothing else. The interesting thing for Cuba, and the interesting thing about the embargo is although the embargo is still very much in place and it restricts Americans to only 12 types of travel, these 12 types of travel actually take people out of the resorts, because an American, you're not allowed to go and sit on the beach. You have to go for education or festivals or culture, but it actually takes you into the real Cuba. So if you want to go sit on a beach, you can sit on a beach anywhere else in the Caribbean. But if you really want to see Cuba, now is the time that you actually get to see the real cities, the real culture, the real values, because there's not that much tourism development outside of the resort areas. So just as a context, Cuba's the Caribbean's largest country, and they have an amazing wealth of diversity of things to do. But I also need to warn you, if you're traveling, it's also a very expensive country to visit. The Cuban convertible peso is stronger than the US dollar.
And Rachel, I just have a question. You fly, I assume, from Canada to Cuba, right? Did you ever go there from US?
No, I would never fly to Cuba from the US. It's much more expensive. We can fly Cuba for Eastern Canadians. So I live in Toronto. So anywhere in Ontario or Quebec, which is sort of straight north of that red dot, it's the cheapest sun destination for any Canadian in Eastern Canada. So you can do an all-inclusive week package sometimes for $400 Canadian, which is about 300 US. If you travel from the US, so we were doing some surveys with American tourists when we were down in Cuba last month. The premium to fly from the US to Cuba is another sort of 25%. If you fly on regular scheduled airlines, it costs you a lot more. You can pay up to $1,000 for a flight. But if you fly from the US, you're looking at even more than that. So it's much cheaper on a package from Canada than it is, or even from Mexico, than it is to try and fly from the United States.
I just received an email from Southwest. It said that it's starting flights from Tampa to Havana, and there is one more city, but I forgot where they fly. And then they said that it is $59. That was a promotion, one-way $59. I went there to see, and they are starting at the end of November. I went to see if I could buy, but the $59 was not available. It was more like about $100, $150, which is much cheaper, I guess, than what you just quoted, which is wonderful news.
Yeah, but don't forget, you're talking about Tampa, Florida, which is 50 kilometers away. Canada is 3,000 kilometers away.
Right. One of the panelists is telling us their study abroad is using JetBlue and flying our return trip $154 from Orlando to Havana, each March 2017.
That's about right. I wouldn't expect it to be more. It's not very far.
That's great. Wonderful. Okay. I would like to ask the audience if you have any questions for our panelists. Please feel free to write this in the questions or chat. I've been following them as we go, which is great. So let me see. And Babu is also writing some other things. But one of the panelists, Julia, is from China. I believe that for non-Americans, visit Cuba from America doesn't have the same restrictions. Rachel or Babu, do you know anything about that?
I don't know I don't know the nitty-gritties, but I am told it is far easier to fly from Russia, China, or some of these countries. I am told there is a direct flight from Beijing to Havana.
Oh, really? That one I didn't know. That's wonderful.
Yes.
Great. Okay, then I would like to invite the audience to ask any questions if they have. But I would like to ask both of you, you mentioned this in your introductory speeches, both of you, but is it an interesting destination for Americans? If it is, yes, why? And Rachel, Babu, whoever would like to jump in can start.
Sure, I'll start. I think it's a really interesting destination for Americans. Most of the Americans that I've met when I've been in Cuba say they want to come before the Americans go, which is kind of a funny thing. And right now there's more Europeans outside of the resorts than there are Americans. So even though the media is hyping it up, saying it's really busy, a lot of the first scheduled airlines flights from the United States are running half empty. So a lot of the Cubans are saying, where are all these Americans that the media keeps talking about? Because we don't see them. But it's a fascinating place to visit, mainly because if you look at the development of Cuba, the entire development has mainly been on sun, sea, and sand. And their plans for the next 5 years are also on sun, sea, and sand. They want to grow their hotel rooms from 60,000 current rooms to 80,000. So that's an increase of 20,000 rooms in the next 3 years because of their virgin beaches. But if you're American, you can't go to the beach just to sit on a beach like you would for an all-inclusive package, but that's what makes it so fascinating. The embargo, it's almost time warped. Raul Castro, who's currently the president, will not be serving another term after 2019, and it'll be a real turning point for Cuba. Already, private enterprise has cropped up. Already, there's more abilities to stay in local houses that are called casas. But at the same time, you'll see history and culture that is unparalleled. If you go to the ballet, it's the third best ballet in the world after the London Ballet, and I'm not quite sure why the second one, maybe the New York Ballet, because that's what they focused on. They focused, their medical system is bar none. The literacy rate is 99%. There's no crime, there's no drugs. It's extremely safe. And on top of all that, it's a very easy place. People are happy, people are friendly. A lot of people think that the embargo was put up to stop communism, but it's very interesting to go to Cuba and hear the Cuban sides of things. So anyone who's from the United States that doesn't always believe everything they hear in the media will be fascinated to go to Cuba and really learn about the real Cuba and the real history and the festivals and the events and the towns. I just put a couple pictures together of my recent trip to Cuba to show you that it's more than just the beach. This is just an example of architecture in Havana, and they have restored over 33% of old Havana, which is the most successful restoration process. And the next slide shows you San Cristobal is the restoration. They have basically turned around the old city of Havana. So what was crumbling and looked like Beirut after the war, some places are amazingly restored, and you walk 3 blocks out of the restoration zone and places will be crumbling on the ground. So it's a fascinating juxtaposition. Cuba's a country of contrast. What some people are making, this is a guy rolling cigars, and so the history is great. Some people will be making 50 kooks a month, which is about $50 a month, and living on that. And people are moving into the tourism industry because they can make up to $4,000 a month. So the influx of tourism is really changing the nature and the private enterprise of Cuba, which makes it an amazingly interesting place for Americans to go before American enterprise is allowed to get in. On that note too, however, if you try and book a hotel in Havana, my guess is it'll be booked up until September of next year. So you'll have to stay in casas or independent enterprise unless you have some very good connections.
And Airbnb too, right? I heard one of our students went there and used Airbnb to get a room.
Airbnb is there. Yeah, Booking.com has started. Airbnb is just an example of casas. It's just a distribution system. The other thing too is there's 60,000 old cars. My worry about the embargo lifting is that once the ferry to Miami is due to open, and you can just imagine that in a city, the capital city, where you have donkey carts and old cars that have been pieced together with parts of toasters, etc., because of the U.S. embargo not being able to get anything, what's going to happen when this ferry opens and all these old cars are just going to leave right back to the United States? So I think that's one of the reasons why Americans want to go before it comes. And this is a picture of Trinidad. You can see the beautiful mountains behind. It's also a UNESCO heritage site. Cuba has more UNESCO heritage sites than anywhere else in the Caribbean. I think they have 257 national monuments and 332 museums. It's amazing. 25% of the country is designated as a national, as a protected area. So the architecture is stunning. You'll get neo-Gothic, colonial, just Baroque, every possible period of architecture. And this city is, 5,000 years old, and it's entirely cobblestone streets. It's just quite incredible to go and see places like that still exist. And this will exist in Trinidad and Havana, which you just don't see. So some places it's third world, and some places it's first world.
Right. Is this a donkey cart?
Yeah, it's a donkey cart. It's just a local guy. And there you can see the cobblestone streets. So it's you feel like you're in Europe sometimes.
This is Lada, I think, right? It's a Russian car?
Probably.
I'm not sure. So very beautiful pictures here.
So just a few things that people don't think of when they see Cuba is they don't think of the natural areas, and they don't think of these cenotes and
right.
underwater caves, open air caves, sorry.
And Babu, would you like to share your views about the Cuba? I see that you are posting some chat items there. Please tell us.
Yeah, so I was just going through some of these questions raised by the participants. You know, I wanted to share one big issue, you know, which is my current research interest is the straining labor market. A lot of people are turning to tourism. A lot of people working in other sectors are turning to tourism because of the opportunity to make quick money. You know, you find computer programmers, you find engineers working in restaurants. So it's going to take a huge toll upon other industries. And tourism is extremely uncertain, you know, seasonal, cyclical, and also uncertain given the geopolitical scenario. So I don't know how much of a smart move it is to encourage that kind of a shift. So that's something that I am really concerned about. The other question that someone asked was about Cuban hospitality. Oftentimes, a matter of disagreement is, you know, because of the lack of training in the American-style hospitality, you know, people may not always come and ask you, how are you doing? Like in, you know, when you go to Walmart. The expressed hospitality is different, and the difference in the cultural expectations means, at least sometimes American tourists misunderstand it. I have been doing a you know, user review analysis using this IBM software, IBM Watson, and I figured this out that there is often a misunderstanding in the minds of American tourists. When American-style responses are not given, American-style smiles are not given, many American tourists think, no, Cubans are not really hospitable, which is not true.
Right, yeah, that's great.
I agree. You should also note too is that the service is depending on where you are. If sometimes in a casa you could stay in a local Airbnb, and the quality is not consistent. So one could be absolutely amazing, and the people will get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to make you the most fantastic breakfast you could ever imagine and help you with your bags and be wonderful. And the next one you stay in might have cockroaches running across the floor. One restaurant you may go to has the most amazing, interesting food. The food in Havana is amazing now with the amount of independent restaurants popping up. But you could go to another restaurant, you could wait 45 minutes for your bill.
Mm-hmm.
So
right. This is great. Thank you. One question came from one of the audience members. Is it, can you please let us know about the residents' attitudes toward tourism development in Cuba? So what do Cubans think? Do they welcome tourism?
Currently, they welcome tourism. I think, I mean, there's a number of Cubans that have only been alive during the embargo. And there's been a number of Cubans that have left. Some people are somewhat cautious about the, here's an example. So the University of Havana, the hardest program to get into is hospitality and tourism, because they have to be able to speak English as well as a second language upon graduation, French or German or something else. Their grades have to be the highest, but it's still oversubscribed because people know that working in the tourism industry will make them more money than they ever would. So one of the issues of the socialist government is that people don't make very much money. So it's not uncommon. The average wage is $50 US a month. And if you're working in the tourism industry, you can make 10 times that amount. So right now it's very positive, but a number of, on the ground when I've been talking to locals, they are concerned about how quickly some things are developed. There's the sewage infrastructure is not very good. Parking is not very good. They have water scarcity issues. There's been no planning for the amount of resorts that are going to be developed for the water. They plan to tap it from the mountains, and that could be disastrous for the country. So there's also sometimes, it was more so in the early 90s when you as a tourist would go into a store and you would bypass the ration system and you could buy everything first, and the Cubans were made to wait. That's changed a lot. So the level of equality and opportunity in private enterprise has actually been welcomed by most Cubans.
Babu, would you agree?
Yes. So I'm just typing it. You know, In terms of tourism, generally, in my understanding, there is a positive preference, positive perception. However, there is also a perception that top employment, senior positions in the industry often goes to outsiders, especially in the partnership properties. One group of stakeholders that are really happy about tourism development, in my understanding, are the Cuban Americans. They send money back to Cuba. Many of them have invested in second homes, and these second homes have become tourist stay properties. So it's kind of beneficial. And again, people find an additional means of livelihood. So I agree with Rachel, everything what she said. Yeah, these are my additional 2 cents.
Great. And there is another question from one of the audience members. She says that I know there's a popular destination called Little Havana in Miami. And there are a lot of Cuban people in Havana. And I assume that these are some of them are the ones that go after the revolution. Is there any relationship between the Little Havana in Miami and Cuba? Is it, I guess she's asking, is it authentic?
I don't have any expertise. I'm sorry. I will not answer that. I will not be able to answer that.
Some of the food in Little Havana is the same because you've got Cubans living there. And there's a huge population of Cubans living in Miami. But does it look the same? No. Havana is a colonial Spanish-looking city. The architecture is old. Miami is a new city. So just from that alone, it's completely different. The layout of the streets is different. What's happening is different. The cars are different. But on some things like the food, it's very similar. And interestingly, the Canadian perception of Cuban food is dreadful, but that's because it's generated from people who stay at all-inclusive resorts. And there, I do agree, the food is generally not so great. But when you leave the resorts and you go into small restaurants, some food is fantastic and some food is not so fantastic. So
just like any other place.
No, I would say that the food in Cuba has a long way to go, but there's been some really innovative, interesting places. So if you're looking for a salad, you'll be looking a long time. You'll see, in terms of vegetables, almost all of them are canned. Even though Cuba's a large country, they import almost everything. And if you need to understand about the Cuba clause, which means that any ship or any vessel that docks on American soil cannot touch Cuba or go to Cuba on the way there or the way back for 6 months. So if you're trading with a country like the United States, you're not going to waste the potential to go to Cuba. So when Cuba imports their goods, they're getting them from Spain or from China or whichever. So you're not getting fresh vegetables. You'll get fresh fruit that's grown locally, but you won't see broccoli. You won't see green beans. You won't see those kinds of things that we just have an expectation as North Americans that we will get everything fresh all the time. That's not the case in Cuba at all.
Do you think that will change with the removal of the embargo?
I don't see any removal of the embargo so far. Okay.
Another question here for, again, feel free to answer either Rachel or Babu. The question here is about American citizens. Does the panel think that American citizens are ready to explore Cuba culture with an open mind and to welcome the cultural and political differences? What do you think about that?
Sorry, just to clarify, whether Cubans will travel within Cuba?
No. If the American citizens are ready to explore Cuba culture and embrace the cultural and political differences. So she's asking more from the American side, if, like Rachel, you just mentioned that Cubans are saying, where is the Americans, right? So it appears that they are not flocking Cuba yet. But do you think this is because that because of this history for 50 years on embargo and this forbidden, that the perception towards Cuba is negative in Americans' minds? Do you think?
I think it depends which Americans you talk to. So if you're an American and you're looking for an all-inclusive beach stay, then you're not going to be able to go to Cuba. So you can only travel for one of these 12 reasons. And the adventure operators that are offering them are sold out. So it's mainly at the moment older Americans who have more money because these trips are expensive and they're longer. You can't just go for 2 or 3 days. They're usually sort of 12 days, 14 days, things like that. And they are expensive, upwards of sort of $4,000 if you're booking with some of these big adventure companies like Road Scholar or Intrepid. But on the other hand, most of the Americans that are going on these trips are interested in the history or the culture or the festivals or the art scene. So they are finding it fascinating. If you're an American who's interested in that kind of thing, then I'm sure there's quite a lot to learn. If you're an American that's expecting an American style holiday with American service and American food, then you're going to be very disappointed.
Yes. So in my view, it may seem like a kind of overgeneralization. However, Americans, wherever they go, they have the kind of, I shouldn't probably use this word, but master-slave mentality. It's very rare to find Americans going to a place for cultural exploration or seeing a place from the viewpoint of the residents. I think that's repeating even in the case of Cuba. Yes, Americans are going and gazing at the frozen time period in Cuba, time frozen for so many decades, but they are looking at it from the American prism, colored glass. I really don't think Americans absorb or assimilate the Cubanness when they reach there, except a minority of backpackers. Yeah, that's very problematic.
Right. And one more question from the audience members. If Cuba wants to attract more tourists from US, what changes do they have to do to achieve this? Any suggestions? You mentioned some of them, right? You said the hospitality as we perceive in America is different in Cuba. Maybe service standards. And Rachel mentioned about, like, if you're going to get a salad, you're not going to find it. Or if you may get a wonderful meal, but you're going to wait 45 minutes for your check. Do you think those are the things that they need to work on? Or maybe not. I don't know. Maybe that you may suggest that they would stay authentic. That might be the thing that attract people. What are your thoughts about that?
I think there's a difference between being authentic and being service-oriented. So some places in Cuba are very service-oriented, but not to the level of American standards for the most part. The infrastructure is still struggling sometimes. If you open a ferry terminal in Havana, for example, and let American cars and people drive over, it would be catastrophic because they just don't have that many vehicles right now. So that, from an infrastructure point of view, would be terrible. If cruise ships, they're building a cruise port in central Havana, which is the most visited destination after the beaches. If you allow 3,000 people to vomit onto a town, you'll absolutely ruin, I think, personally, the experience that Cuba has to offer. Only time will tell what's going to happen for those kinds of things. The Cuban government is well aware, and Cuban people are well aware of the mistakes that other destinations have made. The difference will be is whether they actually plan and mitigate these issues before it actually arises. And I think that's why, of all the Americans that I've ever talked to in Cuba, that's one of the reasons they want to go, is they want to go before the Starbucks show up on every corner, before American business mindset arrives in Cuba, because the authenticity is something that's so fascinating. But on the other hand, the service level for many is not up to American standards. I stayed in a supposedly 4-star hotel in Havana and paid a fortune for it a few years ago. And I was stunned at what I paid for and what I received. And I'm Canadian and I'm well-traveled. But it depends. I think they definitely need to work on their service. They definitely need to work on their expectation levels. But if you go on an all-inclusive 4-star hotel trip to Cuba, it's going to be pretty much the same as if you go anywhere else in the world. It's just going to be 1 star lower, because a 4-star Cuban hotel is more like a 3-star Jamaican hotel. So it really depends on what the expectation of the visitor is.
Babu, what do you think about the same question?
So I just noted my comment there. The unique competitive advantage that Cuba possesses will erode so fast if it opens up to everyone. It will just become another place in the Caribbean. Of course, Cuba has a lot of specialities, but the mass tourists are generally interested in a few things, and the minority attractions. The Cuba is extremely attraction diverse, but the minority attractions, the attractions that are not of interest to the mass tourists, will wither away. I believe Cuba should continue to remain a niche tourism destination, at least for the next decade, and then maybe slowly develop the infrastructure. The infrastructure is so poor. The airports cannot handle tourists. Airports cannot, hotels cannot accommodate people. There is not enough transportation, ground transportation. So I think it should be a slow and gradual process. And it should not be, Cuba should not be for Americans alone. Cuba should not be for Americans alone. And it's a strategic move, because tomorrow the relationship might soar again. So what will be the future of Cuban tourism if the next president put a ban on travel?
And I think Babu is very right that they need to focus on it. The interesting thing, although the Cubans have really learned a lesson, their plan right now is to build 20,000 new rooms, all on virgin beaches, such as Caya Sabanel, Caya Cruz, Caya Romano, all along the North Shore, which is completely away from the local population. It's away from the culture. It's away from the history. So although the history, the culture, the cities, and the natural areas are their true differentiator, Cubans are actually building, along with their 51% public-private partnerships with Iberostar and Spanish hotels, and will be American hotels soon. They're completely contradicting what they say that their differentiator and their unique selling point is. So in Canada, their entire marketing campaign is authentic Cuba, but yet 1.5 million tourists from Canada go and sit on the beach. So it's very contradictory, and Cuba is contradicting themselves. So the best thing for the Americans, I think, the best thing for Cuba will be as if the embargo is not lifted and the 12 ways to travel to Cuba remain. Because as soon as if it is entirely lifted, Cuba will change overnight. And I'm not surprised why so many people want to go now.
We have about 5 minutes left for the panel. I just would like to ask you, there's quite a few students in the panel right now. If you were to give some ideas to these students about research topics in regards to Cuba and Americans or elsewhere, what would you say? Are there any, I know that you both have conducted research in this regard, but with the new developments happening, are there any topics or things that you would like to suggest to students to look if they are looking for a topic for their thesis or project or class project, whatever that might be?
Oh, I have thousands, but
please go ahead.
Start.
Please go ahead, Rachel.
Well, for me, what my main research focuses on sustainable tourism, and I think the impacts of the cruise ship would be a very interesting potential subject to look at, is what the implications of a cruise terminal and cruise tourism would do to Cuba. I think another really interesting thing would be, I think if you're visiting Cuba and you really want to do proper research, you need to be able to speak some Spanish. So the level of English is not very high in Cuba still. People are extremely educated, but they're not necessarily English speaking. They're Spanish speaking nature. So I think the perceptions of Cubans versus Americans, I just had some of my students go down and ask American perceptions of Cuba and why they went and how different it was to what they thought before. That was a very interesting topic. I think the another really interesting class project would be to determine the key unique selling points of Cuba, and from a marketing perspective, why the unique selling points are not being used as differentiators for countries. And this could be Cuba compared to Jamaica, or the threats that other Caribbean countries see for Cuba opening up to American tourists.
Babu, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just, I typed a couple of questions there. So, it's very difficult to say offhand, a set of interesting questions. I believe it's a good idea to see why, someone asked here, why Americans visit Cuba. And Americans is not a homogeneous group. There are different kinds of Americans, different kinds of people from the United States. So if someone could, examine what are the motivations for graduate students or students to visit Cuba, or I mean, you may think, these are very straightforward and simple questions, but as we do research, we might unearth a lot of unexpected things. Another issue is, what are the motivations for people to, go in a package tour to Cuba versus as free independent travelers? Someone was talking about, one student, I think someone wrote here about the fear factor. Many Americans still prefer to, join a package tour because they are risk averse. So one issue to study is the role of risk. In terms of factual information, I would say that Cuba is much safer than many other countries in the Caribbean, thanks to the government control on everything. But a lot of Americans think that Cuba is very unsafe, so Americans have a tendency to prefer to go in groups. So that could be another issue to explore.
Great. And Rachel, just add 2 more topics here. Rachel, would you like to just talk about them?
I find it very interesting for all you Americans that you're not looking at what's going on with your recent election campaign and your recent winning president. And that may be, I can't really speak to it, I'm Canadian, but there's been a lot of talk around the rest of the world about the implications for other countries outside of America based on Mr. Trump's foreign policy, his perceptions on immigrants. There's a lot of illegal Cubans in the United States, and whether or not he's going to round them up and send them home and put a wall around Cuba as well. There's a number of different things. What's going to happen with Guantanamo Bay? I think it's a very interesting issue, and the embargo has been put on Cuba by the United States. Cuba did not put the embargo. Cuba did not put the embargo. The United States put the embargo. So it's up to the United States to lift the embargo. It's actually not up to Cuba. And there's a number of different elements, especially American Cubans who left in 1959 and still have expectations that property should still be theirs. And that's another really interesting research topic, that there's a lot of political pull within the United States government about Cuban interests based on 60 years of history.
Another topic that fascinated me is how the institutions are changing. The social institutions, the economic institutions that supported tourism were informed by a different model of economy and society. And with the opening up, with the change in the leadership in Cuba, and with the change in institutions as a whole, not only tourism practice is changing, but also the institutional structures are changing. Some of you interested in the doctoral level could, pursue those things. The socialist communist institutions are slowly changing to market-focused institutions. So it's a good idea to map the changes.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. If you have any closing remarks, Babu or Rachel, please feel free to do them. Otherwise, I'm going to close the panel very soon.
It was very nice to chat. It's a shame we couldn't hear people's thoughts live rather than just Babu and myself talking, but it was great to be on a panel with you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity, Cihan. It's a great pleasure, and I learned a lot from this interaction. It gave an opportunity for thinking about things I wouldn't have done otherwise.
Thank you. And Mr. Collin is from CubaEducationTravel.com, which is the company which he couldn't come. I know that if he were here, he would have given us some information. But if any of the audience members is interested, I will also type that CubaEducationTravel.com is his website. And I know that, Babu, you had one link in your slides also too. We were going to make this available to audience members. But I appreciate both of your times. Thank you so much. And I also thank the audience to attend today's panel. Have a wonderful, great International Education Week and Day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.